Medical information on this site is provided as an information resource only and is not to be used or relied on for any diagnostic or treatment purposes. This information does not create any patient-physician relationship and should not be used as a substitute for professional diagnosis and treatment. Please consult your healthcare provider before making any healthcare decisions or for guidance about a specific medical condition. Doctors Ruhoy and Kaufman shall have no liability for any damages, loss, injury, or liability whatsoever suffered as a result of your reliance on the information contained in this site. Hi, and welcome back. This is episode 21 to Unraveled. Today we're going to have a conversation which comes up often in the office or during telemedicine visits. We were trying to figure out a title, so we've decided real quickly how to maximize your primary care office visit.
Which is usually a very short period of time.
Right. Your primary care 20-minute office visit.
Right, because we have said on our first couple of podcasts how we are able and give lots of time to patients just to get the appropriate comprehensive history that we need to get. Unfortunately, as you know, the healthcare system doesn't allow for PCPs to do that.
So I think it's important to just say at the outset that primary care doctors are really
salt
in
of the earth.
Trenches on the front lines and get screwed constantly.
Constantly.
Okay? I mean, I was a primary care doctor for 30 years in New York. All right. I was a specialist in HIV, but I also did general internal medicine. And without getting into my experience, primary care docs are they're dumped on, they are undercompensated, overwhelmed, et cetera. And now in the last 10, 15 years, medicine is mostly corporatized. It's mostly run by corporations, whether they're Amazon running One Medical or hospital systems owning the practices of primary care docs. Their time is limited. They're literally paid on quote productivity. So it's not so much different from an Amazon, warehouse worker in the sense of how many packages did you process today? How many patients did you see today? So their visits are very limited. So I sometimes think I come across critically of PCPs, primary care docs, and I don't really want to sound that way, although I know sometimes I do, because I think they are up against an insurmountable challenge, and it's the system that's a problem. That said, everybody should have a PCP. I know when I work with a patient, I insist they have a primary care doctor. It doesn't always work out, but I need that doctor to be able to collaborate with. So, what we thought we would talk about today is how to make the most of those visits. And what I mean by that, among other things, is how do we make it easier for your doctor to hear you, think about what might be wrong, and try to help you?
Yeah, because patients do have a role in this, right? So
Absolutely.
It's a relationship, and so it's important to prepare for the appointment, and if you with the appropriate preparation, you could optimize the 20 minutes the PCP has for you, and get something out of it in return. Feel like this was a worthy appointment,
right? And sometimes, to be clear, the initial appointment might be 50 minutes or 45 minutes.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
But it's still not my 2-hour visit, preceded by an hour or two of reviewing records, followed by an hour or two of preparing my write-up and orders and testing and stuff. So that poor PCP literally has 20 minutes and then the next patient comes in.
Right.
And they're often then doing their electronic charting at 8 or 9 at night.
Absolutely. And it's because of what you said, because they're run by a corporation. They're run, so they don't have autonomy.
Right.
And that's so unfortunate. It makes me sad, actually.
So how to start? I think if it's the first time you're seeing your doctor, and you have septad type symptoms, chronic fatigue symptoms, and you, the patient, have done your research and have an insight into what might be wrong, I would suggest you don't start by walking in the door and saying, I'm here because I have ME/CFS and a septad and POTS. Okay, because that doc is going to look at you like you're out of your mind, or, oh my God, when is this going to be over? Okay. I think you want to bring a history in, but you want to be as concrete and objective as possible. And to the degree it's possible, use more easily diagnosable conditions.
Right.
Which is one of the reasons I love the septad concept. I'm a broken record on this, I know that. But everything in the septad every single doctor has actually learned about, with one or two exceptions, okay? But they don't know anything about ME/CFS. They don't know anything most of the time about long COVID. So if you go in saying that, you're going to get nowhere, all right? If you go in and you say, Doc, every time I stand up, I get dizzy and all of a sudden I can't think straight. And I found this thing online called the NASA lean test, the poor man's tilt table, and I did it, and look at my numbers. And you're off and running with that doctor, because if the doctor's a good doctor, as most doctors are, they're going to look at that and say, well, wait a minute, when you stand up, your heart rate goes to 120. Something's really wrong here. We got to get to work. And it doesn't matter at that point if they don't say, well, what about your mast cell and your CCI and your EDS? They're going to get started. So I don't know if I'm saying this as clearly
No,
as
you are. And
it
comes down to what is the most prominent concern that you have that is really impacting your daily life, to label it, to show objective stuff if you can, like the NASA lean test is a perfect example. Because the other thing that we should mention is that, it's run by billing codes, right? So they need a diagnosis to bill.
And up until literally this year, 2023, there was no billing code for ME/CFS.
I know, isn't that crazy?
No code.
I know.
So that tells you something. It's been around since the late 19th century.
Right, exactly.
Probably since the
But orthostatic hypotension has been around a long time, right?
Exactly.
So if you come with those kinds of symptoms and some evidence that might be potentially your diagnosis, or it might be POTS, of course, then that's something that they could bill for. That's something that they can put. There's a diagnosis with an ICD-10 code in their EMR or EHR, whatever they
refer. It's also something they can understand.
It's something they can understand.
You're bringing something measurable to them.
And there are guidelines as to how to treat it.
Right.
And so it's very conventional treatments that we do also as first-line treatments, and that's okay, right? So then you start somewhere.
And granted, editorial moment, the nature of our healthcare system, unfortunately, most PCPs in that situation can immediately refer you to a cardiologist or a neurologist. Personally, I don't think that's appropriate. This is doable by a PCP, but at least that might get you started. So in terms of advice number one, if you think you have any septad type illness, ME/CFS, long COVID illness, look up NASA lean test and do your own lean test at home and bring it with you. It's so easy. It's so quick. And it's numbers. It works.
Plus, I think it gets the relationship between a patient and their doctor off on the right foot, because now the doctor has a diagnosis. The doctor actually has a treatment plan in mind. And I think that, doctors, listen, we all want to help. I think that's why we all got into medicine. And I think a lot of doctors just, when they become overwhelmed with these complex patients, they just don't know how to help. And that puts them in an uncomfortable spot, or, in a place of uncertainty, and no one wants to be there. And so, but this would allow for them to feel like they have some control over what they can offer the patient. And I think that in the end, it's like everyone feels good about it.
It's somewhere to start. It's a concrete starting point that's measurable,
Right.
Okay. So a second thought. It's probably better in the beginning when you see your doctor not to walk in with a 2-inch loose leaf notebook of tests that you've had and history stuff. Not to say that's not incredibly important, and many patients bring that to me, but I'm kind of the guy at the end of the road in the sense of choosing doctors, because that poor doc, that PCP is going to look at that and say, oh my God, I don't have time to read this. This person must be nuts. They're bringing me all this information. So I wouldn't bring it.
Right.
Or select out the things
I agree with that.
That help the most. Okay.
Yeah, I think I don't want to say it turns doctors off when patients bring so many records. I think that's the wrong words to use, because they're not turned off by the patient necessarily, or they shouldn't be, certainly. But I think that the idea of all this work that they're going to have to put in to read through all this tests to try to figure out what's going on, and they're just short on time.
Right.
So I think that's really overwhelming.
I guess one of the messages here, this is I'm feeling like I'm being confusing in this podcast, but I can't help it. I'm jumping around. When you see your doctor, it is not a one-way street. You're just as responsible as a patient to make that visit useful and productive. And it's not a one-way thing.
Right.
And it's very important to understand that when you go in. And that includes considering what that physician is working with. And you could say, well, that's not my problem. He's my physician. I don't want to have to deal with that. I pay insurance, so it should cover everything. That's not the way it works. Let's be realistic, okay? So I'm curious to hear what you say about this. So most physicians use a document, a pre-visit document they ask patients to fill out, whatever they may call it, okay? And in that document, usually there's an extensive review of systems. Most of our patients, when they would complete a review of systems, will pretty much check almost every single box. That's the equivalent of bringing in that 2-inch loose leaf notebook for that physician. They look at that and they're just like, oh my God, look at this. So I don't know what the right answer is. I don't think patients should withhold information, but maybe they need to use a sort of quantified judgment approach to their review of systems and not include every single thing. Try to point out the most important or those that are most easily addressable in a 20-minute visit. So I get dizzy when I stand up.
Right.
All right. And I have headaches. I can't think of another example.
Right.
Rather than what we know that our patients do have, which is pain, headaches, brain fog, muscle pain, joint pain, stomach pain, all that stuff.
I think a good intake questionnaire does allow grading for a symptom like, rare, occasionally, frequently, or severe, moderate, mild. So it at least will point out the ones that are more frequent and more severe. And there's usually a spot that says most prominent concern. Like, what is the most important thing to address today? And I think that an appropriate intake form would have those components on it so that it's not just sort of this pan-positive review of systems.
Actually, that's a really good point. So the way we're taught to approach a patient visit and write-up is, what's your chief complaint? Mm-hmm. If you say your chief complaint is, I'm a septate patient with ME/CFS and I had Lyme disease, and you've already lost it. You've lost your audience, okay? So chief complaint is, just because it's easy, I get dizzy every time I stand up, okay? History of present illness, HPI is the next step, right? Can't believe I'm remembering all this. So history of present illness, you can go in prepared to say, I was fine until I had mono at 19, and since then, every time I stand up, this happens, and I feel worse and worse and worse. Mm-hmm. You're providing a link that may be, and is, I believe, accurate, but it may help that physician say, well, wait a minute, there is a connection, because I did read. I remember in medical school that they taught us that a viral illness can cause dysautonomia. Bam, you are moving down the road there. Okay?
Yes.
What comes after HPI? Physical exam?
Past medical history.
Past medical history. Oh, good, thank you. So past medical history. I would suggest that you don't say I've been to 15 doctors for this problem, okay? I'm not telling people to withhold information or to lie, but I think you need to judge what will be useful, productive information to bring to that doctor.
Absolutely.
Okay? Don't say I've been to 15 doctors. They're all a bunch of idiots. They never believe anything I say, because you'll now have a 16th who has the same feeling.
Exactly.
Okay?
It's selective information that you're choosing to share because they're, again, a finite period of time. Right. So you want to select what you choose to share in that particular appointment. Right. Over time, once you've established a relationship with this doctor, there'll be plenty of opportunity to share the rest of your history. And I think that's really important. You don't have to share everything all at once, because it is true that you sort of, it's like any relationship, frankly, right? When you first meet anyone, like, you have to sort of get to know them. Like, how much do I want to tell you about my life, right?
Exactly.
I mean, in some ways, it's sort of similar, which is, I think, weird to say, I guess, now that I'm thinking about it. But
actually, it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, I mean, you sort of have to get to, and it's like a little dance. Like, how much do you trust one another? And I mean, obviously a doctor's role is to help you, but they don't know you either. And so if you just sort of come at them with all this information, they're also, I mean, doctors are humans, right? So it's like, when you are sort of overwhelmed with a lot of information about someone you've never met before, that has everything to do with their health, like it can be really hard to just embrace and digest and understand what this person wants from you as a doctor.
Right.
And I think that's why selective information initially is what's important, because there will be time to share it all.
Yeah, and along those lines, when you give the history of the present illness, be as clear and concrete as possible. Yeah. Precise, thank you. And think about this in advance. So just to keep using the same example. So if you've come to the conclusion, I'm going to focus on POTS, even you may not know that name as a patient, be ready to tell when you feel not well, what makes you feel better. When you're not well, what's wrong? Not just I don't feel well. Try to be a little bit more specific. If you've discovered things that help, like, I notice that when the days when I have 2 liters of fluid, I feel better than usual. Or on those days when I have lots of food with salt in it, I feel better. That's valuable information for that physician. Okay, so put some thought in preparation into your visit before you go to the visit.
And I like the point that you made. I think that, when you were well and then when you were not well is such an important piece of information that your doctor should hear about, because it really gives them, a timeline, and it also gives them an event, right? So you were well until you had mononucleosis, and then you've no longer been well since.
Exactly.
And that is a really important piece of information. So be armed with those kinds of pieces of information, and not, I think a lot of patients, because they read so much and because they listen to our podcast, and they sort of want to bring up something that might have happened in the 5th grade that they think might be related because of something they heard, either we say or other doctors in our group say, that they think it might be related. It's the first appointment with a new PCP or any new doctor, I would argue, is not the time to necessarily bring up random events of life that you think may or may not be related because of something that you read or heard. But if you know that you were well until this happened and then you've no longer been well since, then that is an important piece of information.
So in medicine, we talk about the doctor-patient relationship or the doctor-patient rapport. How do you get along? And physicians are taught how important that is. we are arguing, that's just as important for the patient to work on.
Yes.
You need to try to present yourself and your history and the way you interact with that physician to develop a good doctor or patient-doctor relationship, okay? You want that physician engaged with you if possible, because you're going to need multiple 20-minute visits, all right? You can't cover it all in 20 minutes.
Right.
And I think most physicians, once they're engaged with you, they're not necessarily going to have the labels that we keep throwing around, ME/CFS, long COVID, septic, et cetera, but they will start to be interested.
Oh,
right. So
absolutely.
The first
we
visit,
see it all the time.
Yeah, the first and second visit, you kind of work through this POTS thing, which is the easiest one, I think, in terms of a physician, in terms of what we're talking about. But then you can say on your third visit, this is helping me, thanks. And, I was reading about this condition called EDS because there was an article in the Times and also in the Atlantic and in the Washington Post, because all this stuff's all over now, okay? So you don't have to sound like you're digging deep as a patient. It's right there all the time.
Mainstream.
And it said, it's a pretty common problem. And it made me think that when I was a kid, I kept dislocating things and have sprains. And I loved gymnastics. And I was a great ice skater. And I've learned that there may be associations. Do you know anything about that?
That's a perfect way of bringing it up, and also perfect timing of when to bring it up. You're right. Once you've established that rapport, then you can say it just like that too, by the way, which is obviously very just sort of plain and blunt without any kind of, I was going to say like emotion, but I know patients, obviously there's emotions involved with your illness.
Yeah,
so I don't want to say you should be, not emotional. But I do think that just to sort of put it plainly and bluntly and in a very objective manner, like I read this and I thought this, is there any connection? What do you think?
But I'm also suggesting in the initial getting to know each other phase, which could be 6 months, okay, that the I read this material is common lay, in quotes, lay publications, not I found this article in the New England Journal or I found this article in Neurology, That already, for most physicians in the beginning, makes them concerned. I have a patient who's sitting there all day long researching, okay? I don't think that's bad. I mean, for me, it's been great. I love it. But you have to remember, as the patient, you need to engage that physician and make it work for him or her. And you're not an easy patient, okay? You're not coming in saying I have a sore throat 102 and I have white schmutz in my tonsils, okay? That's easy, all right? No brainer for everybody. So it takes work on the patient's part. They have to be ready to do that and understand some of these I was going to say weaknesses. That's not the word I want. Some of these challenges that the physician faces, and how can we make it easier?
Right. And that's true. And it's hard to say, and I'm sure for the patients, it's hard to hear. It is an unfortunate part of their illness, of being a chronic and complex patient, is that it is a fact that you're not easy for doctors who don't understand the illness that you have, who don't understand ME/CFS or long COVID or EDS or mast cell activation or dysautonomia, So it's just another, again, sad fact of the illness, which is that you're just not an easy patient for doctors, especially those doctors that work in the more conventional healthcare system that you and I were fortunate enough to not to be able to leave. But, a lot of doctors aren't. And so for various reasons. And so you're not an easy patient. And that's something to embrace and something you can improve on in terms of preparing for the appointment in the ways that we're suggesting, to really come armed with, the most prominent concerns, what you hope to at least address, today, because you need to, because it's really impacting your daily life. So that is important to have in your mind about answers to questions that you want to be sure that you leave this appointment with. And along those lines, you should actually write those questions down. Again, it shouldn't be 40 questions. There isn't enough time. It should be probably no more than 5 questions about the most prominent concern. And, and doctors will actually appreciate that, because it will give them sort of a way to navigate the appointment, knowing that you have specific questions. I actually love when patients have questions, because then I know that I can address those questions in this appointment, and that I will have satisfied what they hope to get out of this appointment because they wrote questions down.
Right.
So I think that's another thing that people can do.
Yeah. It provides a roadmap, a guideline to have in the visit, and often a very good way for the physician to be able to summarize the visit. Because you want to make sure that as a physician, you want to make sure that what you've said is clear and understood.
Right.
And often the questions let you say, well, I did answer that. Remember, we discussed how you should try drinking 3 liters a day instead of 2 or whatever it is. Okay. And
that brings me to the note they have to write at the end, right? So it is, the questions are nice because it allows them to summarize the appointment well. One of the challenges that we have as doctors is sort of writing the note after the appointment. And we teach such extensive histories usually that the note is long, but it's usually doable because, again, a lot of our patients have very similar concerns. So we have a deeper understanding and can sort of, wax poetic about what might be going on and what we're going to do about it. But sometimes, with complex and chronic illness patients, after the appointment, even it happens to me, I hope it happens to you still. But I'm left with the note going, I don't even know where to begin.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So, and again, and we understand this illness, right? We understand what's going on. And so I always think about those doctors who don't yet understand it on a deeper level. Right. And then they're sort of left trying to write this note, which they're required to do. Otherwise, they can't bill. They'll lose hospital privileges. I remember being in the hospital charting room at 2 a.m. in the morning because I was going to lose my privileges the next day if I didn't finish my notes.
Piles, 3 piles, 8, literally 6 feet high. I know. I'm not exaggerating.
They will revoke your privileges. Yeah.
Ridiculous.
I don't think patients understand how heartless some of these hospital systems are. So the point is, and now, so here's this doctor who has to finish their note. Otherwise they can't even bill, and they'll get audited, and they don't even know where to begin because it is such a complex story. So that's another reason why to prepare for the appointment and just sort of make it maybe not as complex in the initial 1 or 2 appointments, really try to sort of simmer down, again, the most salient questions and the most important concerns that you want addressed today.
So I want to just interject for a second that some people listening to this might say, wait a minute, I'm the patient. Why should I care about all these things about my physician? That's his or her job. They went to medical school. This is their decision. This is ridiculous. It's not my problem. I'm certainly saying, it is your problem. If you want to get heard, thought about, and cared, you have to do some of the work. It's kind of like, before we started today, I went for coffee. There's 2 ways you can get coffee. You can go and say, hi, I'd like an Americano, please. How's your day today? Or give me an Americano. Hurry up. Why is it taking so long? Right. There's a big difference in the way you'll be interacted with. And that applies to everything. But it's
you get more, what does it say? What's the saying? You get more bees with honey than with vinegar.
Exactly.
Is that the
I think
appropriate
that sounds right. So, and I think most people don't think about that with their
Yeah.
doctor-patient interaction, but it's very true. And
It
I
is.
mean, I can tell you myself, there are patients who rub me the wrong way, the way they interact with me, and it's difficult. I can deal with it partly because I have an hour or two of time to deal with that patient, and I can kind of
break down the barriers.
yes. That poor physician's got 20 minutes and another 10 patients after you.
Exactly.
And had 4 before you.
Exactly.
Try to imagine that. It's not your problem as the patient, but if you don't actually add that into the equation, it is your problem.
I think the tricky part is they have to get over some of the trauma that they've sustained from being
good
dismissed and so invalidated so many times. So that's the complexity of that as well. But
yeah, that's so important.
Yeah,
you're right. I'm glad you brought that up. I mean, it's so many of our patients have medical PTSD that they may hear what we're saying, but it's very hard to not be in there like this and watch that eye roll and say,
absolutely,
and then get crazy about it.
Right. I guess what we just sort of are imploring is that, try to just sort of look at this new doctor appointment as just a new doctor who doesn't know you and has nothing to do with the doctors that had seen you previously. And so whatever trauma was inflicted from those appointments, this doctor that you are now going to see is not at fault for that.
Right.
And I mean, it's easy to say, of course, harder to do. But, I think it's an important thing to try to be cognizant of.
So another piece to mention or discuss is the visit ends, and if the doctor's done a good job and the patient's done a good job, presumably it ends with a plan. And that plan will likely include some laboratory data, maybe an EKG if we're using our POTS model. Maybe the doctor says, wow, I never knew about this Nasaline test. Could you do a few more of these for me? Do one in the morning, do one at night, and let me see what it looks like after you eat. Okay? I mean, that would require some extra thinking on the doctor's part, but, they could get there.
Yeah.
Okay? And you leave, and you have an follow-up appointment in 4 weeks. If you don't do those things as a patient, you've blown it. You've already lost it. The point I'm trying to make is it is a two-way street. Patients need to follow the directions they were given because presumably the directions were given for a reason in order to help understand their illness and develop a treatment plan.
Right.
So if the patient comes back in 4 weeks and says, oh, gee, sorry, doc, I didn't have time to do the lean test. I had a headache and my niece graduated from college. Honestly, I don't think those are acceptable reasons. And I hear it in my practice. So obviously some of my patients may know where I'm coming from. But I think it's a really important point.
It is.
In my practice, or in my case, I sort of get it, and I'm going to be having an ongoing relationship. I already know what's going on, so you don't have to convince me, okay?
Yeah.
But your PCP, again, it's a relationship that needs to be nurtured. And if you don't do your part, you're blowing it.
That's absolutely true. And you're right. It does happen to me also, where I give like a million recommendations, and then I see them in 6 to 8 weeks, and they haven't done it. Right. And I usually have very good relationships with my patients, and so sometimes I'll laugh about it, and I'll be like, okay, why didn't you do it? And then there'll be similar complaints and concerns, in terms of symptoms, and I'll be like, well, if you had tried what I had said 6 weeks ago, So again, having a good, but that comes in time, right? I mean, a lot of my patients I've been seeing, because I haven't been taking new patients for a long while now, a lot of the patients that I have are the ones that I've been seeing for a very long time. So we have very good relationships. So it's, it's back and forth, but you have to get to that point with your doctor. And if you have a PCP, by the way, who is not seeing chronic and complex illness patients, but has taken interest in the way you presented your symptoms in your first appointment to the point where they're thinking about, let's do this Nasaline test a couple of other times, and here's the parameters I want you to put on it, because I'm interested to sort of see how this changes the results.
Exactly.
Then that's exciting, and you have your job to do now, right? You don't want to lose that enthusiasm,
the momentum. You want to keep that momentum
right?
up.
Exactly, because in fact that's our entire goal. You and I, we want other docs, to get enthusiastic about helping these patients, and so there is a role for the patients, and I think that's actually the point of this particular podcast episode is like, what is the role of the patient? And we understand the limitations. We understand that you don't feel well. We understand that you're in pain. We understand that, there are some days that you basically can barely get out of bed to, make yourself some breakfast.
Right.
We get all of that. But to get more doctors to be able to help you, there is some role that you have to play in all of that.
Well, a big role,
you know.
not just some, a
Yeah.
very big role, I think. It's such an important point.
Yeah.
Let me move it a little bit to a slightly different topic that you and I talked about before we started, which is, let's say it's a new primary care doc. I mean, I'm sorry, that the patient's looking for a new primary care doc.
Has not yet found one.
Right. And this comes up a lot. What should I look for? Okay. So this is partly my own opinion. I think that your best chances of finding a physician who will be more open to dealing with these issues and thinking about them and learning about them is an internal medicine doctor, an internist, family medicine doctor. If it's at all possible or affordable, a concierge practice, which allows that physician to have more time, and it is understood. There's already a contract, in quotes, between doctor and patient that doctor is actually going to put in more effort.
Right.
They're not going to be driven by RVU. Is that what they are?
Correct.
RVUs. They're not going to be driven by the clock ticking. And if you can afford it, and there are many variations on concierge medicine. You don't have to spend $12,000 a year.
No, in fact, direct care, I think, is sort of a less expensive, more economical way of doing concierge.
Right.
And I might be wrong for those who are in direct care, but there might be some other distinctions. But that's what I understand it to be.
Is what we do.
No, direct care is they're PCPs. So it's primary care. Right. So that's the difference.
But it's not taking insurance.
They don't take insurance, and there's a monthly. No, we don't do that because there's a monthly fees, and so then there's just access to the doctor.
Right. Right.
And as far as I know, the direct care docs that I know give like their cell phone numbers and things like that. Easy ways to.
So there's a lot of variations.
A lot of variations.
I guess what I'm saying is for patients, don't assume that quote concierge medicine is off the table for economic reasons. It can be very doable. Okay?
Right, and some concierge practices take insurance, right? So in fact, the few
most
that I know,
most of them do.
They just have a
so they pay a big fee and then they take insurance. Or the direct care, there's a much lower membership or subscription
like a membership
fee.
But they don't take insurance. Yeah.
Right. And then there are some that kind of mix all that.
Hybrids,
But I think that this is now opinion, okay? I think that the training of an internist and the training for family medicine, family practice docs as primary care docs, certainly for internal medicine, I'll speak for myself, we are initially taught to think very widely, not silo. I mean, that's kind of what internal medicine was always conceptualized as, and I think it's changed a lot. Unfortunately, it's changed often to internist says, okay, then go to a cardiologist. Hopefully you'll find somebody who doesn't do that, but I think it's a better starting point. I'd put it that way.
I completely agree. I think there's lots of options these days for sure. Right. And it doesn't mean that no matter where you live in the country, it's easy to find someone. And I do think that still some people will have a difficult time finding.
Yes, I think it's always going to be difficult.
And I don't know if there's any great answer to that. Now the pandemic, of course, making telemedicine much more like normalized. Right. I think that's opening up doors. There's a whole world now for patients to find doctors, and most doctors are willing to do telemedicine. So I think it's actually very helpful. So even if you live in a rural area, for example, where there isn't, concierge or direct care or lots of PCPs that have any time at all, or even taking new patients, frankly. Some of them just close down, So there are, you can call into the hospitals in larger cities nearby and see if, there's telemedicine options. So,
So there's two other topics I want to bring into this. I'm sure you may have more too.
Yeah.
So we were talking about a patient going to their PCP with these problems, presumably without me involved, all right? MECFS, CEPTED doctors are not in the picture. Then there's this second group of patients who have doctors like us, who must still have a PCP, okay? And one of the important challenges and hopes is that the primary care doc will collaborate, bolded, italicized, capitalized, collaborate with us. All right. I don't know what to call a CEPTED specialist. How does that sound?
Ooh, I think we've just coined a new term.
And I keep telling patients this, and I am very open to speaking to every PCP.
Oh, me too.
I want to teach this. I mean, we desperately need to educate and recruit more doctors into this stuff. Some of them are not going to move over and do what we do, but we can certainly educate them as PCPs with this material. And there's a lot of efforts going on. I actually starting to see glimmers of light at the end of the tunnel with the webinars that you and I have been part of, and the Project Echoes, and
I completely
certain
agree.
meetings and stuff like that, and hopefully even this Patreon channel. So I'm hopeful. But meanwhile,
it's slow though.
It's very slow, and I appreciate, having been a PCP, how overwhelmed it can be. So when you see your doctors, you can say, I have somebody who's a specialist in this complex illness, but he or she would like to work with you and needs your help in order to take care of me. And would you be willing to email with him or her? Would you be willing to talk to him or her? If you're not sure what LDN is, he told me he'll teach you what it is in 5 minutes. All right. If you're not sure what why a lean test is worth doing, and talk to him. He'll tell you. He'll, we can discuss it. So I think it's an important thing, and the patient is in the middle. They're the fulcrum for this, the middle person to make it happen. So I regard that as part of the patient's job.
Yeah.
Okay.
I agree. I tell them to give my contact information to their PCP, and I tell them to let their PCP know that I'm available to talk to them whenever they want. And I'm often very happily surprised about how many PCPs reach out. Yeah. And we have good conversations, and I think that's a good sign. And
I agree.
I think it's a harbinger of good things to come for chronic patients. And so I'm hoping that momentum continues for sure. And I love to teach. I've sort of gotten to the point where, well, obviously I'm still willing to talk to any PCP about a patient. One by one, though, doesn't get me to where I want us to be in terms of just sort of education and recruiting other doctors, or at least helping other doctors understand these patients so that there's more acceptance, and which will only lead to obviously more dialogue and more research, of course, and a more focus on these complex patients, which, I honestly think that the more you think about what goes on with the septet patient and its physiology, the more you could start to apply it to diseases that we've always known about.
Oh, yeah.
But we say, we don't know what causes
it.
Like just dumb shit luck.
That's a really important point that I keep resisting and censoring so carefully. That for a primary care physician, there's an opportunity here for them to leverage what you as the patient bring into their other patients. And I'll give you a really simple example. LDN, okay? Low-dose naltrexone doesn't only work for an ME/CFS patient or a septate patient or a long COVID patient. It works for a patient with back pain. It works.
That's right.
I'm telling you, it works.
Does.
And if that physician realizes that, suddenly they don't have to worry about, oh, God, I don't want to prescribe Percocet and OxyContin. I'll get in trouble, and I shouldn't do it. I know I shouldn't, but the patient has pain. What am I going to do? Give LDN a try. All right. And that starts to happen. Physicians do want to help their patients.
They do. And they run out of ideas.
Right.
And that's why what we do and what we see and what we know can be so useful to them if they were only willing to open up their minds, eyes, ears.
In terms of education, this series that you and I have been part of a couple of times at any rate, the webinar on the Project Echo stuff.
Yeah.
I initially was a little skeptical about it, but I am so totally on board. The fact that in this last one we did, there were 400 people.
I know, it was amazing.
Watching and listening.
It was
amazing.
It's like,
whoa, I couldn't believe it.
I know.
And then I asked, where do they come from? And most of them are healthcare people. There's patients, but mostly healthcare. I'd love to see them do some follow-up assessment of the impact of watching the webinars. But they are about everything we're doing. I mean, the title, I think, is Fatiguing Illnesses.
Yeah,
right?
which I had never heard that term, and I actually loved it.
It's great.
I know.
It's fantastic.
I'm giving a talk in September in that series.
Yeah, I'm doing in
EDS.
June or July on POTS.
Am I a part of that panel?
I don't know. I have to look and see.
Well, you got to be part of my panel.
I put you on the last one. And actually, I would tell our Patreon subscribers, look this up and tell your doctor.
Yeah.
It's free. It's CME.
I know.
It's done at a lunchtime.
It's amazing.
And it's CME. And it's really good.
Really well done. I was so impressed by how it was well done.
So well done.
And I like that setup, by the way, of a speaker and then the panelists, right?
So it's 15 minutes of a speaker, PowerPoint
which I hadn't
type
seen
thing.
the Echo programs do before, by the way. It's always just sort of been one speaker. I had never seen it with like a panelist
the panel
of
idea is
experts.
great. And then it's literally 45 minutes of question and
I
answer,
know.
which is when you learn the most.
It was amazing. I was just sitting there typing out answers while you
So again, I wish we could put this on our show notes for some
I know.
because anyone can go. This is free. You can do it as a patient,
Yeah.
and you can say to your doc, "Hey, you want to learn about POTS? Look what I just saw. 12
right.
to
You know
1,
what? If somebody
get a
writes
credit."
in, I guess we can just put it on the Patreon page, the link. I was going to say, if somebody writes in, what's the link to that ECHO program, then we can answer with the
Okay.
link.
All right.
But I think we could just do it without somebody writing in.
Right.
Anyway. But
Okay.
yes, you're right. There's a lot. Your point being, of course, is that there are a lot of new educational
Right.
programs that we at least been part of, and I'm sure there's others that we haven't been
And
part
if you
of.
have a PCP
who hasn't invited us to
that
those
sounds
parts.
interested, let them know.
Right.
All right? Because it's not like they can pick up a book to read about this. There are some books, but it's not so easy.
No, it's
Okay.
not easy.
Okay, so we did how to go to your doctor, how to collaborate with your doctor, and I want to talk about a third topic. How to walk out of your doctor. Okay.
Do you mean like how to
fire your doctor?
How to fire?
Okay.
Oh,
So
okay. That's different than how to like walk out.
Touchy topic, okay? Having said everything we've said and having expressed my feelings about the difficulty in being a PCP and the challenges they're up against and my empathy for what they go through, nevertheless, there's going to be situations where it's not so good. And I would argue, or I would suggest, that if you go to your doctor, we'll continue with the same example, with your lean test, and the doctor looks at it and says, "Oh, this is garbage. I don't know what you're talking about." I would just leave.
Which happens, by the way.
Of course
Yeah.
it happens.
I mean,
don't make a
regular.
follow-up appointment. I really feel
Yeah.
that way. If you
have to let the doctor know that they have failed you.
Yeah.
I mean, it's so my point is that some patients will just say okay, and even may even make up the follow-up appointment, maybe even schedule it, and then we'll cancel it
Right.
or not show up, or,
Right.
which is worse. But my point is that you have to I think you should let the doctor know that this appointment was not beneficial to you, and that they have failed you.
Yes, but let me qualify that for a second. So
Okay.
First I want to say, as a patient, give yourself credit for your own insight and understanding in what you feel in your body. You are not making this up. You're not neurotic. You're not hysterical. You're not lazy. You're not nuts. These are your problems. It's real, okay? We're suggesting when you go, you keep it concrete, understanding the limitations that doctor's working under. And if you do those things and you present useful data and the doctor rolls his or her eyes at it, I don't think you should try to continue with that doctor. You might want to do one more visit and see if maybe it was a bad day, which can happen to every one of us. Maybe the patient before you was a total pain in the ass, and so the doctor hasn't recovered yet. But I don't think you keep going if you're not being heard. I'm a little less sure about what you just said in terms of telling the doctor, partly because that's not easy for patients. I think it's good to do, because I think maybe if the doctor hears it enough times, maybe he or she will say, "Wait a minute, what am I doing wrong? Why aren't I? Maybe I need to change." But it may be asking a lot of a patient that's already has their PTSD, et cetera.
Right. No, that's a good point.
Say, you're not listening to me, I'm not coming back. I mean, even saying that simple statement is not so easy to do when you have the white coat sitting opposite you and everything else.
I think that's a really valid point, and you're right, and I take back what I said. I mean, the one thing I take issue with is this hierarchical thing that sort of has happened in medicine, which is like the doctor is up here and the patient is down here, right? So that I'm just trying to think of ways of just sort of making an even playing ground. And so if you can't express, a disappointment, then, you're still sort of, and you're right. And maybe in the end, it doesn't matter. You just sort of know that this is not the doctor for you, and you just sort of move on about your business and find another doctor. I do think that the more doctors hear that patients feel they're not listening to them, as you said, maybe some doctor will say, "Oh, wait a minute, that's like the fourth patient in the past month that has said I haven't listened. Maybe I am missing something," but that may not be true either. So you're right. I think saying nothing is okay too. One of the things, I was once interviewed for a Washington Post story on gender bias in medicine, because, women do get the short end of the stick, of course, because we're immediately assumed to be emotional and hysterical and dramatic. I was even told that I was hysterical and dramatic when I had a big brain tumor pushing down on my brain. And so there, and I was a neurologist, but still my female presentation, obviously.
Which really shows you how
influenced,
unbelievably powerful that bias is. You were
Absolutely.
a neurologist and they still did it.
That's exactly
It's
right.
mind-boggling.
It's exactly, which is why I was interviewed for this story. And one of there were a lot of very, the writer was incredible and she wrote a phenomenal story and she asked a lot of really important questions. And one of the questions sort of struck me as like, well, what can patients do for to prepare for their appointment that could help prevent that, which is sort of the topic of this episode.
About,
But it was specifically referring to the gender bias, right? And I sat there and I honestly didn't know the answer because every answer I came up with almost sounded like I was saying, don't be a female, right? Which of course is not the problem.
Right.
But it was like, well, what am I going to say? Don't be emotional, or don't have any kind of emotion attached to your symptoms. Don't present it in a way where you're saying that, you can't, do things, can't take care of your kids. You can't be there for your husband. You can't be there for your job, your friends. You can't be social. Like, I actually could not think of any answer to this question because everything seemed to imply that being female was the problem.
Right.
And that is not the problem.
So you have to come in dressed as a non-female.
Right. Right. Exactly. So I guess my point is that, even all that we're saying, there still might be gender bias, right? Because gender bias puts the onus, truthfully, on the doctor at that point in that particular scenario. So that's the complicating factor
it's very
here is what I'm saying.
And I think, I'm not sure if you're saying this, but to a certain degree, there is very little you can do about that as a patient, except recognize and acknowledge it and kind of keep it in your computations and your thinking of how you'll approach this visit. Expect that may be a problem. All right. And it may be, frankly, a reason to seek out, if you're a female, seek out a female physician.
Right.
You know what I mean? I think
right.
that's
that was the only other thing I can come
point,
up with the writer. It's like, well, then, you should find a female physician.
Right.
Yeah.
And again, understand that for primary care physicians, they get chronic illness in the sense of chronic diabetes and chronic atherosclerotic heart disease and chronic dementia, okay? Mm-hmm. They don't get chronic complex disease.
Right.
That's where the failure is, or the disconnect is. And yes, your job as patient is not to educate your doctor about complex illness. Your job is to understand that doctor is not there yet. How can you help them get there so they can hear you and try to help you and either refer you to an appropriate person or work with your septet specialist productively?
No, absolutely. I agree. That is the role of the patient. But my point being, of course, there's a larger point here, which is that it's not going to, it's not going to combat any kind of bias that the doctor might hold. Right. And that's not only gender, of course, but, race even, for example. So, doctors hold biases. And I think even the most prepared patient, won't necessarily counteract all that. And,
right. And if you, the patient, see that there's a problem, then I'm suggesting don't
move
do
on.
A follow-up. Move on.
Yeah, move on. Don't waste your time.
Yeah,
I completely agree. I completely agree.
Don't. This is not going to sound right, but don't feed your PTSD by trying to stay with that doctor.
No, it
You
does
need to
sound
try to find another.
You shouldn't.
And if you can't find one, how do you find one? Find other patients. I mean, at this point, thank God for the internet. There is so much forum, chat, blog information online. You can get on to, whether you're a Facebook person or whatever, and say, what doctors are you guys seeing? Have you found somebody?
Yeah.
All right.
That's where I find patient support groups on those social media sites
incredibly
so valuable for them. And not only because they help to find doctors who understand them and are willing to listen to them and willing to take the time, but also I think these patient support groups sometimes fill in the gaps where doctors don't have time.
Yes.
Right. So all these PCPs that only have 20 minutes to give, even the caring ones, the ones that are trying to help, they don't have the time to sort of cover everything. So these patient support groups and even the patient advocacy groups, in fact, I'm giving a talk for the GBSC IDP patient advocacy group in a month, but these groups fill in those gaps where doctors just don't have the time to do so, to help the patient in the extensive way that they would like to if they had more time. So there's a lot of value in a lot of these groups that are now, I mean, I think the internet has brought a lot of great value to patients in general. And obviously, I mean, there are some downsides to the internet, but that's with every new technology. I mean, look what AI is doing. There's good and there's bad, right? So you sort of have to embrace the good and try to avoid the bad if you can.
So just to make one last point, which we touched on with the Project Echo webinar stuff, let's say that it works, right? You, patient, found a PCP. you engage with that doctor. He or she gets it. They listen to you. They're trying to figure it out. At that point, you can, I would suggest you should, and that you can gingerly, carefully help to educate that doctor. So, for example, what does that mean? You can pull the MECFS paper off Mayo Proceedings and bring it in. I mean, full disclosure, we both participated in writing it, but it's actually written for PCPs. How do you diagnose? How do you take the history? How do you diagnose, and how do you treat? I mean, it doesn't get easier than that. It's like a little recipe book. You can bring in a link to Health Rising and Phoenix Rising, which actually have enormous wealth of information and references. Always references here, references there. The doc may not be interested, but maybe if you've developed that rapport, you can start doing that. Don't bring in 4 inches of papers, reference articles. Don't come in and say, yeah, but I read over here and I read over there that you shouldn't do that. Why are you telling me to do it? You've lost the doctor. You know, you can say, well, I'm a little confused because I've heard other people with this problem don't take LDN. Why do you think I should? I mean, hopefully you found somebody who would say that. But so you have to use, I guess part of what I'm saying is what you said earlier in this conversation at the very beginning. Think of how you work and deal and interact with your doctor the way you would with a friend, a family member, a kid. It's all similar.
Yeah. It's another relationship is really what it is.
Right.
That's the important point.
Okay.
And both can benefit, right? I mean, my God, I benefit all the time from my relationship with my patients.
Oh yeah, it's incredible.
So I think that's what we're trying to say.
Right.
It's a relationship where both can benefit if both play a role. So
yeah, you've definitely hit a home run. If you as patient get that doctor engaged so they look forward to seeing you the next time, you have a home run on your hands.
Absolutely.
And that can happen. I mean,
and it's a good feeling.
Doctors love seeing what they call, quote, good patients.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean what you might think it means. It can mean interesting. It can mean fun to talk to. It can mean I learned so much from the patient. Those are good patients.
Yes.
So I want to make sure that that's clear. A good patient sometimes is used not in a way that people think is nice, and I'm not saying it that way. It's that you as patient are as valuable to that physician as a colleague physician might be.
That's right. That's a perfect way of describing it. Yeah. Awesome. That's a good note to end it on.
Okay.
All right. Send us off.
All right. Please. Thank you very much. Please send in questions. I enjoy reading the questions. It always sounds like Dr. Ruho is answering, but I try to tell you it's me. I don't know. We haven't been able to fix that. Right?
We're so tech unsavvy.
And please believe we want more doctors. We want to educate doctors. We want to help. And if you can get your doctors to listen to this, that would be great. And if they want to do the webinars and stuff, be fantastic.
Great. Thank you for joining us.
Okay.